one of the most important experts in the world in the matter of open access. He has served also as advisor for several institutions, the European Commission, government in France, and Quebec, right? And so I thanks in advance for your lecture.
Well, thank you very much for bearing with me for the afternoon. I hope my French accented English is not going to be too difficult to understand. If you don't understand, by all means, don't hesitate to stop and say, I don't understand. Sometimes it's my English, sometimes it's my brain. I don't always express myself as well as I should. And what I tried to do today is discuss what we really want to achieve, perhaps, when we talk about open science. And I've used the word open science because it has become, as you may know, almost a buzzword. I'll come back to that expression later on. But the European Commission in particular, in the recent past, has decided that they don't deal with open access anymore, they deal with open science. And there are good and less interesting elements to that. I will try to propose a particular vision of what I understand by open, which is more promising for the future of scientific communication. And in fact, I will leave the word open to call it free, but in the sense of libre, in Italian, libre in French, as the real objective. So I start with a definition which actually I slightly manipulated by removing a couple of words for the moment, and it comes out in this way. And I think you might not disagree too much that this could be an interesting way to deal with scientific communication. You could look at it as a development method that harnesses the power of distributed peer review and transparency of process. The promise of open is better quality, higher reliability, more flexibility, lower cost in many cases, and an end to predatory vendor lock-in. Now maybe the last sentence gives me away and provides you the key to where the source is, because actually this came from software. It came from Eric Raymond, one of the nemesis of Richard Stallman, since he was the fellow who began to talk about open source in contrast to free software, free as in free speech, as Richard Stallman used to say, and has created in this manner a lot of discussion in the area of software. But nonetheless, even though I tend to side very much with Richard Stallman, I had the feeling that that definition by Eric Raymond was useful, because if you go back to this definition, you can see that it fits also very well science. Because why? Well, what is science? What really is it? Is it scholarship, or what is scholarship? What do we do with science? And the answer is the development method that harnesses the power, etc., etc. It is the same sort of thing. It's a distributed process. It's a process that relies on the faith that distributed intelligence, rather than collective intelligence. I hate the term collective intelligence. I think stupidity is easily collective, but I think intelligence cannot be collective. You need some degree of individuality in it. But the distributed intelligence is what makes science do what it has done, which is to create the ability to deal with extraordinarily complex problems that no single individual could ever have, ever tackled. Not even Newton, not even Einstein. The very proof is that Newton tackled what Newton solved, and so did Einstein. But neither of them have given a complete, total, final, universal, etc. answer to what our question is, which is what's the nature of our reality. So the phrase open science comes out to be perhaps nothing more than a tautology. If science exists, it has to be open. Science that's not open is not science. So you need open science automatically, and one may be asked immediately, why do we have to say something redundant like open science? And I'm going to try explaining to you a bit more why I think we do need to underscore the idea that science has to be open. Why is it, as I was just saying, I was getting ahead of my slides, why is it that we have to say something obvious? The answer is not just a possible answer, I think that's the answer, is that science is not working as it should. Science has developed something in the 17th century in Europe which was really remarkable, and I'm going to come back to that. But it has, since the 17th century, been shaped and reshaped by conflicting forces trying to take advantage of science in such a way that nowadays science is no longer working as it should. In the 17th century, what really happened is that people were beginning to understand that they had to speak to each other and focus together on similar problems if they wanted to go beyond what an individual could possibly achieve. The whole thing was actually made possible by the development of the mail system in Europe. People could write to each other. It sounds like a very small thing, but it made a huge difference. And people were sending letters to each other. Sometimes very weird letters for scientists writing to each other. For example, when Galileo discovered the four of the satellites of Jupiter, he sent an anagram to Kepler as a way to take Kepler as a witness, but not revealing to him yet what the discovery was, simply because he wasn't entirely sure yet of his discovery, but he wanted to establish his priority in the discovery. So he enlisted, in effect, Kepler in being the witness to this sentence that Kepler could not decipher, until a bit later Galileo gave him the clue when he was absolutely sure of himself. But that gave him a sort of prime model of what communication in science is about. I communicate to establish in front of everybody that I've done that on such and such a date. I have done a piece of work which now can be completely verified. Now, in some cases, like the example I just gave you of Galileo, which will repeat itself in a number of academies where scientists regularly would submit what they call sealed envelopes. On such and such a date, I gave this sealed envelope to the secretary. This was in case there was a controversy about the discovery, and if somebody had found the same thing, but published it after the sealed envelope had been sent around, the one with the sealed envelope could still claim that, although when he had the sealed envelope, he still had some doubts as to the possibility of completely proving what he was after. Nonetheless, he had done a good deal of the work also, and he deserved some of the credit. Now, this is part of the scientific distributed system. People publish to establish their own contribution in a process where people constantly correct, criticize, or add and cooperate with each other. It's a very complex system, both of competition and cooperation, and it is done through that communication system. In passing, presenting things as I'm doing right now today, I'm saying also something which appears to me extremely important for the rest of my presentation, but also to think about these issues in general. We have been used to talking about scientific publishing as a sort of special phase in research. You know, you do all the work on the bench in the lab and so on, and all in the library if you're in the social sciences, and then at one point you have written some sort of synthesis of all that, and you're ready to submit it to someone, to some publisher, to some journal, to some editor. And at that point, the game is generally treated as if it were a different game from now on. You submit a document to someone who's going to have it evaluated. I'll come back to that. And there are new considerations that begin to enter into that. What is the outfit doing the publishing? How much money do they make when they do that? Are they looking for money or not? How do they disseminate what I'm submitting to them? How do they evaluate all this? And on and on. And it's all taken as a separate phase in the general cycle of research. Actually, the way I'm presenting it here today, with the issue of the male scientists in the 17th century, the building of the first journals in 1665 and so on, is to remind you that actually that communication system is deeply embedded, deeply, profoundly embedded in the whole cycle of research. Research does not exist without dissemination, and research doesn't have any meaning without this system of communication. The result, therefore, is that the communication of science is not only an integral part of research, should be probably treated by whatever supports scientific research in general by the same means, and it is something that works completely at the center of science, because without it, many of the processes of the scientific evaluation, quality, and orientation would not happen. So it's really part of the research cycle. It's a very important part. And those who control that part have a real amount of power over the whole scientific enterprise. A lot of power. I'll come back to that. So, how do you publish something? Some of you already have gone through the kind of exercise that it represents. Here is a series of arrows on that. I tried to find one that was as complicated as I could, just to underscore my point. It's a complex process. You submit, the journal sort of acts quickly to say, well, does it fit more or less with our editorial orientation or not? If it does, this is an editorial prerogative. If it does, then it's sent on to reviewers. Reviewers give back their comments, then the article is either treated as unacceptable, or perhaps directly acceptable, or more commonly acceptable under the condition that the number of edition changes, whatever, be made. Then there is a kind of back and forth trading between the author or authors on the one hand, the reviewers and the editors, in this kind of loop that keeps on repeating itself once, twice, three times. And then the paper takes on a final shape, which is then submitted to the actual, you might say, mechanical publishing process, which in the old days involved a printer, in nowadays involves a server with a web designer and similar kinds of skills. So you have there a system which immediately brings to light something that must become very obvious to you. If you think of science as a distributed system of intelligence, with people which used to write to each other letters, and this created the sort of conditions needed to have what I personally like to call a great or grand conversation. That conversation with that kind of system is very halting. You know, you write, it takes months to get the whole work done. Finally, the paper appears, then it is disseminated. By the time people who are interested in your paper can see it and review it, it may have been indeed years. And by that time, you may have shifted your interest altogether. You may even have more or less forgotten some of the stuff you were doing in that paper. And somebody somewhere is going to say, no, I don't agree with that part of your paper because, and then the conversation starts again. But it's a halting, it's a kind of badly tempered piece of music which doesn't work very harmoniously. It creates, in effect, a series of disconnection and dissonances in the conversation that should be at the center of the scientific enterprise. Then there is another question, which is probably the most crucial one, which is, where do you publish? And that's where it's going to be very crucial, because for your career, whatever the quality of your work, it's where you will publish that will have a great deal of importance for your evaluation of yourself as a researcher. You will be evaluated by that. If you manage to sneak in an article into Nature, you will get far more credit in your institution than if you do the same paper in a perfectly respectable journal with a perfectly good dissemination pattern, but which is not Nature. In some countries, you're paid for that. In Colombia, I think you get it every time you get an article in the Nature, you get a whole month's salary supplement. Just that, 8% more in your salary in a year, 8.something%, because you publish in Nature. China apparently does similar things. A number of countries are doing that. In our countries, we don't give outright money like that, but similar things happen indirectly. You get more perks, you're put in better positions inside your institution, and you command greater authority, privilege, and prestige than if you had not done that particular kind of publication. Note that I've talked about where the paper appeared, not what the paper said. And there have been some amusing, not studies, but at least I would say polemical calculations produced by one of our colleagues in Germany, Björn Brahms, who has been doing some work on what is the best predictor when you talk about journals and impact factors, coming soon to the question of impact factors. What does it predict best, quality or possibility of retraction? And it turns out that for quality is very iffy, but for the possibility of retraction, it gives a fairly interesting probability that it will happen, and the higher your impact factor is in the journal, the higher the probability of retraction. Why? Well, because people are so pushed into trying to appear with their papers in such journals that they sometimes don't do exactly what they should really do. It goes from the benign, like don't do all the verifications you should do, all the way to the outright fraud. And this we have heard many examples of in your common reading. So here is the impact factor appearing. You probably all know what the impact factor is. Essentially, it's within a certain collection of journals, and I'll come back on that. You just see in 1 year how many times the articles on average are being cited in the next couple of years. So you can have in this fashion a sort of measure of what is called the impact. Now it looks like a very simple matter. Just take the articles, take the group of journals that you think is important, and then you look at how many times the articles in that journal in 1 year is being cited in the other journals of the club, because it's like a club of journals, and you do that over 2 years, and then you just do your ranking. Now there are a number of interesting things that lie behind that, which have to be recalled rather, and which are, I think, very much of importance for our discussion today. The impact factor came out of an entirely different kind of project, which started to emerge in the 1950s in the United States, with the name of someone that you may have heard in your studies, Eugene Garfield, G-A-R-F-I-E-L-D. And Eugene Garfield was trying actually to solve a problem for a very prominent molecular biologist at the time, which was that there was no bibliography for molecular biology. It was a period when science was exploding in quantity of publications, but also in diversity of fields, and a lot of interdisciplinary fields were appearing, and there were no good ways to track down simply and efficiently the literature you needed to follow what was going in your field. And that's when Garfield, with the help of the the Nobel Prize winner Lederberg, thought of the idea of tracking down the citations of articles. In effect, saying you could sort of follow who knows the work of whom in order to be able to retrace paths of thinking that would allow you to jump across disciplines and thereby get into areas which you might not have thought of in doing your bibliographic search and which could be very important for your research. Now, the problem was that we're by then in the early 60s, 1960s. The problem is that by that time, the ideal situation would have been to find all the journals in the world, and thereby all the scientific articles in the world, and then trace all these citations in those articles, and just give the whole map of this whole thing. Well, obviously, this was impossible. This would have required following a number of journals which already at the time worldwide would have been probably around 30 or 40,000 journals, if not more, because that number has never been terribly well described or ascertained. And then, of course, the number of articles in these journals probably gives you an order of magnitude more, and then the number of citations probably one or two orders of magnitude more. And the computers at the time just couldn't do that by hand. Obviously, it was something that you just could not even begin to consider. So, what Garfield did is, well, there may be a way to justify it using only a very small number of journals. And in so doing, I'll be able to track my citation in a way which will not be entirely accurate, but will be a good you might say, sampling of world science, because you look at the essential part of science. So he invented this idea that there was an essential part of science. And to justify that, he used all library studies of the 1930s by Bradford in England and others, which have noted that in any institution, any library of any institution, the local people in this institution were capable of doing their research by really following a relatively limited number of journals and articles. Perhaps in your own research, you resort to something similar to that. You know, you have an idea of maybe the 5 or 10 journals you must absolutely follow in order to, in your mind, not miss most of the important ideas that might be coming up in your field. Now, that's very fine when you have yourself at the center and you look at the landscape of publishing and you've identified what's important to you. What Garfield did was to do a kind of upside down situation of that by saying, well, I can just aggregate all of these things. And we're going to find that there is actually, for anybody, always roughly the same journals journals that would be of importance. And to do that, he imagined a fable in which people are librarians discussing how to develop collections, who come with their list of journals, and they discuss that, and the windows suddenly, like yesterday with a thunderstorm, the windows suddenly open up, the wind comes in, the lights go out, and the papers fly about, and everything is confused, and at the end of the storm, the lights come back, and the librarians look for their papers, and lo and behold, they discover they all have the same list. Well, this is a myth. This is a complete myth. People don't have the same list in Argentina as in China. It's quite clear. And depending on the topics, these kinds of concentrations of journals, according to some mysterious rule of coreness, you might call it, is totally unwarranted. Well, it worked nonetheless. Garfield decided that with 1,000 or so journals, he could touch the essential part of all science in the world. Now, the way he did that, the way he proceeded to identify those 1,000 titles was interesting in itself as well. He started with people around in the United States in a number of fields, and as they what are the journals you most likely to follow. And then once he had finished that, he decided to, you know, with a little bit of reluctance, to look into Europe with those weird languages they speak way over there, Italian, French, Spanish, German, Greek. But anyway, we're going to ask these people who do science in Europe how they do their things. And they started in this fashion to create you might say, the beginning of a snowballing system of generation of titles of journal. And he stopped roughly when he roughly had 1,000 titles, more or less. And that he declared was core science. And the claim was that if you follow that globally, and in all disciplines, with these 1,000 titles, essentially, you've got all that counts in science. Now, the problem with this approach is that until then, people were navigating the large collections of journals in much more, I would say, flexible and open ways than that particular way. And in particular, they did not divide science and the quality of the journals within science, because what was behind Garfield's idea was actually to identify the high-quality journal, the core journals, as they call it. What you had is a very continuous hierarchy of quality, very impressionistic, developed any which way according to each discipline, where variations could occur nationally, because obviously if you are in Germany, you're going to pay more attention to German publications, even in physics or mathematics, if only because of language. And the same in French, and the same in Dutch, and the same and so on. So what Garfield said, no, this is not the way it works. We already have a worldwide center of science, the core science. And he divided the whole system of the scientific communication system into a two-tier, a two-level system, which led to the creation, essentially, of a tool that could both promote some journals to the Holy Land or to the paradise of core journals, and who could, much more importantly, could exclude journals. No, you don't count, essentially. And the majority of the journals in the world would put in the category of you do not count. And then the criteria to enter into the paradise, as they gradually opened up the number of titles in the core science, which in itself is a nonsense. If you really have found the core of science, you don't have to have a diluted core of science. It makes very little sense to do so. That's a point that Garfield and his supporters have never addressed properly. If you do have, if you open up this thing, what it does on the contrary is that it gives you a carrot and a stick to allow, to try and get journals into your collection the way you want them to be. And one of the important things that happened starting in the 60s was that all these journals had to be essentially in English. That's when the push to put everything in English began to appear. Now, I'm not against everything being in English. It allows me to speak to you today. And so, I mean, there are advantages to that. And in the case of scientific journals, it is probably an advantage that we have, for the moment, a well-established lingua franca of science, so that people in Korea can discuss with people in Chile without having too many difficulties in doing so, because they use one common language. It's a bit like a trade language which you develop in order to facilitate trade. But in this case, the advent of you'd say a notion of core science, a tool to exclude most other journals, and a push to make all the journals have some relationship to English, and as time went on, the relationship with English became stronger and stronger. It started with English abstracts, and it went now all the way to essentially only English. There are relatively few journals now in the web of science that are not fully in English. And this whole thing was developed as a strategy to bring everything into English. Now, doing that from the United States perspective in the 60s and 70s had a number of advantages. For one thing, it made the work of English-speaking labs a lot easier. I mean, many labs in other countries, I'm sure this is the case in Italy, when you start publishing in English, you generally have to have recourse to some people around the university or perhaps around the funding agencies that will be helping you to editorialize your English in the correct way, to write the English correctly. Scientific English has to be learned. It's a lot easier to learn if your native tongue is English than if you are Chinese or if you're an Italian. That's an obvious thing. The second thing also is that, remember these 60s, 70s were the high points of the Cold War. And that was a very good way to isolate Soviet science. So you had, I think, a strategic element in this decision. And remember, this is the time when the Americans were translating physics journals from Russian to English in order to make them accessible to their own researchers and those of Western countries that wanted to follow the excellent level of Soviet physics at the time. So you have there a number of elements that go together and work in the same direction to create this. But this notion of core science was really a very important element to do that. And then, derived from core science, came this notion of impact factor. So not only could you determine which journals belong to core journals, but then you could rank them. You could create a kind of universal competitive game in which people would know that this journal is really top, this one is all right, this one is so-so, in the core level. The rest doesn't count. So you see the kind of radical simplification, reduction, and organization of the scientific communication system that emerges in the 70s because of that. And the next stage in that is still with us. When you have a collection of journals that is presented as being core science, what do you think librarians do? Well, they have to build collections, don't they? And how do you build a collection? Well, very simply, you do it by going for the core journal. So every library in every rich country was buying the same journals. Now, from the standpoint of a businessman, when some things are deemed to be absolutely unavoidable, that is very interesting. That is a very, very interesting situation because it creates an economic situation in which you can raise the prices quite a bit before the demand finally begins to slow down. People need that stuff so much that they'll pay almost any price to get it anyway. So that an inelastic market condition began to develop. Inelastic, not elastic, inelastic. And some large commercial publishers began to understand that scientific publishing was really something of interest. And at that point, the situation that we have lived with ever since the 70s was all set up. This is our situation. And it creates an economic landscape in which publishers end up producing journals with interest rates of, in the case, for example, of Wiley, 42% of revenue. 42% of revenue. In other words, we pay 42% more than not more, but we pay quite a bit more than we should pay if we only paid for costs of production plus maybe a reasonable profit for these companies. This is not the only problem in what I was saying, that science perhaps doesn't work the way it will, but it starts giving you some interesting insights into you might say, the warping of the scientific fabric. The the result is that people who are in very rich countries with very rich institutions end up having a better, easier access to the scientific literature than those who are in poorer countries or in poorer institutions, or both. So the result is that the system of communication really began to create also a system of elite formation for scientific research, which had to do at least as much with wealth as it had with quality. Now, meanwhile, don't forget, you have this notion of a competition that is being developed within science, and sometimes that competition is presented in sort of unilateral manner, with the result that suddenly all the scientists think that they're in competition with everybody else, and it becomes a mad race for resources, for grants, for students, for everything, equipment, for everything. It becomes something totally bizarre when you think of the original project of a grand distributed conversation across the whole of humanity. So that after this long harangue on this topic, I could go on for a while on that, and Juan Carlos knows that well, but I'll go to the next stage, which is, imagine for a minute if all these things about how to submit and where to publish and so on, how it would be if the software developers that built all the internet protocols, Linux, Apache, all the GNU software, Mozilla, LibreOffice, etc., had submitted, waited, resubmitted, transferred their rights, waited some more, until their precious contribution would emerge in a package available only against money. Now, of course, this is happening too in software. I think, for example, the way Apple is handling its apps for the phone has some relationship, some resemblance with the way we publish in journals. There are editorial and economic, as well as moralistic, that were part of science, but in the case of Apple, moralistic dimensions that have been, in effect, contributing to structuring the production of software. And if we had gone that route, if we had that kind of mode of production of software, I think we would be without the internet. But we would have the network equivalent of Microsoft. So remember the French Minitel, the English Prestel, the Japanese Captain, and the German BTX. They were all networks with all the intelligence at the center and all the stupidity at the edges. That this stupidity is us. It's distributed stupidity. Okay. In fact, it goes back to what Joachim Benker, one of the trustees of Nexa, as well described in many of his writings. It goes quite against the network philosophy that is so beautifully incarnated and displayed by the internet. So, when you look at that, you can only come to a conclusion. There's a cost in all of that. There's a cost because the grand conversation is not running smoothly. There are delays, there are repetitions, there are losses of information, and there is massively this exclusionary mechanism which allows a scientist somewhere sitting pretty in a rich country to say, oh, I've done my research, meaning the bibliographic research, thoroughly. I don't have now to, I've gone through the web of science. I don't have now to look at all these funny journals that appear in Brazil and South Africa and so on, even though there may be people doing extremely good work in fields that might be of interest to me, and who, for various reasons, are not capable of accessing the so-called core journals. Now, you must remember that in the core journal, you have competition for market shares. Think of the competition between Science and Nature, for example, those two journals. Those two journals are at each other's throats constantly to see which one is going to have the highest impact factor. Why? Because they want to attract the people that are susceptible of increasing their impact factor even further by virtue of prestige. It's where the scientists, they say it's the Einstein effect, it's the logo effect of the individual author. Einstein has published in our journal, yeah, and so we're going to gain more impact factor. And what does the impact factor do? Well, for those libraries that are still considering whether they should have this title, because of budget restrictions, the impact factor is going to be used to see, well, we'll reject this one, we keep this one. So there's money behind. And then you start seeing the conjunction between choice of topics, choice of authors, and commercial battles between journals interfering with what should be a completely free, objective, open debate among people. If Charlie Nesson were with us today, he would probably remind us.
Later today.
Is he? Okay. Well, if Charlie Nesson were with us, we're here today in this room, he probably would immediately remind us of the way how a jury functions, how a jury works. When you are in a jury inside a court, you're not normally thinking in terms of my decision will affect my job this way and the economic situation of my company this way or not. No, you're thinking about the law, the interpretation of the law, and my best judgment with regard to that. Well, in science, it should be exactly the same as in a jury, but many things now are beginning to interfere because of career preoccupations, modes of evaluation, modes of competition among journals that will eventually result in certain kinds of orientations in science. So, the tautology of open science, after all, maybe is very needed because it reminds us, perhaps precisely because it is a tautology and therefore apparently stupid, it reminds us that there is an obvious need. We need to correct science to make it back, bring it back to its open level. But let's look at that a little more closely, because there again we have some difficulties. What is open? Really, what is it? We distinguish, for example, between, you know it in the free software, OpenOffice and LibreOffice. You probably remember the whole story behind that when most of the programmers in OpenOffice had to fork that particular software in order to get out of the constraints of the company, and they essentially had gained commercial control over parts of OpenOffice by virtue of its own Java. This was the problem. So let's look at open science. My first worry about open science is that it's often, finally, in the end, a kind of diplomatic word that covers many different realities and also limits itself to being largely descriptive. It even becomes, in some ways, a buzzword. Okay? And, for example, you look at the Foster definition of open science. Foster is a project in Europe which has to do with teaching people how to think about open science. And look at this, it's just descriptive, it's a taxonomy. Do you really get any understanding of how open science works with such a taxonomy? I would claim you don't. I don't. Maybe I'm stupid, but I don't. I can learn it by heart, I can repeat it, I can, it would be like someone learning categories in botany without understanding the evolutionary theory behind it. It's just a kind of something that stands by itself and doesn't help you understand what it's about. So, let's look now at the definition that Foster uses. Open science is the practice of science in such a way that others can collaborate and contribute, where research, data, lab notes, and other research processes are freely available under terms that enable reuse, redistribution, and reproduction of the research and its underlying data and methods. I gave you in this particular case the precise URL where you can verify my citation, my quotation. Let me do my own definition of free science, not open science, free science. And as this is totally illegible, I'll give you a clue. Okay, freedom is the essence of science. freedom is the essence of science. In free science, trusted others freely collaborate and contribute. Research data, lab notes, software, and other elements of research processes are also free. Free to access, free to disseminate, free to reuse. Now we know really what's going on. Go back to the one there. There's something very funny which says, are freely available. Now if they were serious about the word free, they wouldn't have to say after that, on the terms that enable reuse, redistribution, and production. Free is that. To be free is to reuse, to redistribute, and to reproduce. You know? So I think it's important to really focus on that notion, and let's call this open science, free science. So the tautology is slightly moved now. It's a tautology towards free science. So what's the main consequence of that? The central currency of free science, in my mind, from my perspective, is not prestige or visibility. It is trust. It is trust. Now, I was talking with one of you earlier precisely on this issue. I had an interesting discussion with Danish colleagues, which was published in an obscure journal, which we are not giving an extra month of pay in the university. It's a Nordic journal on open access, published in Norway, so you can see how remote and marginal it can be, but it's freely available on the web. And if you do in the web, in Google, my own last name and simply crystals of knowledge in quotation marks, you'll get it almost immediately. Now, in that article, what was going on is that a colleague in Denmark is the editor of a linguistics journal, and he was worrying about putting that journal into open access. And he was worrying about money, of course. The whole thing is really about that. And that is a question of policy, it's not a question of open access. If the funders who support publications allow open access journal to exist, then the problem is immediately solved. And the way to justify doing so is what I was saying at the outset of this little lecture. If you treat the phase of scientific communication as a really integral part of the scientific process, then you support scientific communication for the same reason that you support science. You sometimes hear people, particularly bureaucrats, saying, oh, we've got to have a sustainable model of scientific publication. Well, let me give you a piece of news. Since the 17th century, scientific research has never been sustainable. It has always been subsidized. There have been elements of scientific research which have been made sustainable because actually they are parts of development, not really research, and companies have found it useful and important to develop parts of science for products. Fine, but the infrastructural nature of fundamental knowledge is completely unsustainable, and yet at the same time, if you don't do it, well, you may end up in really deep problems. I suspect during the Second World War, if the fundamental work that Einstein had done in physics had not led to that famous equation that we all know, E equals mc squared, the atomic bomb would not have existed. Now, you may disagree or you don't like the fact that the atomic bomb was developed and particularly used, could have been used differently, but you cannot argue against the fact that the presence of the atomic bomb was a determining element of the course of that war. And that was a good example of where science done at a certain level of abstraction can then lead to forms of science which are much closer to what we call development. And in this case, it was not sustainable either because it was military research. So we were discussing these issues with a colleague in Denmark, and he said that, well, journals are important at least because you need to have articles to discuss, and you need to know who the people are that are writing the articles. And suddenly it hit me, what science needs is not journals, it's not articles, It's not authors. What science needs are stabilized forms of expression. So maybe a sentence, maybe a page, maybe a book, length sort of thing, maybe a complex of documents involving videos and sound, photographs, and text. And you don't need authors, you need trusted collaborators. Trusted collaborators. We treat the author, you know, as a kind of obvious and unavoidable entity. But don't forget, the author is a creation of print, and it was a way to both assign property and responsibility for a text once it went through the printing process. Then in the Romantic period, it became this crazy notion that, you know, the book is the expression of the internal soul of the one who was behind that book. The novel, of course, reinforced that vision of the author. But in science, we don't really need authors. We certainly need to know who we are talking to. We certainly need to know that they are respectable and trustworthy people, but we don't need to have scientific stars, for example. Okay, we don't need that. We need, I read this article by Juan Carlos de Martin. Well, I know I can trust that article. Maybe I'm wrong, but personally, I know I can trust that article. I know he's done the best work he could on that. It may not be perfect work. It could be improved. Certainly can be improved. We all can be improved. But I can start from there. I can hang on to his hand, so to speak, his intellectual hand, to try and climb a bit higher, and then try to produce my own stuff independently, but yet related to what he's done. So that's what science really needs. And I call these moments when the mode of expression is stabilized and attributed to someone, a crystal of knowledge. By using the word crystal, I could both allude to the issue of growth. Crystals, as you know, grow. They are stable, very stable. And at the same time, I could also bypass the issue of how big a crystal should be. It can be very tiny, it can be enormous. So in science, we need crystals of various sizes and with various configurations of stable moments of expression that can be there, not because they are the necessary product of a printing system, for example, but rather because the discussion, the dialogue, the great debate, or the great conversation that science is all about requires these moments of relative stability to really examine the ins and outs of a particular way of dealing with a certain series of phenomena so as to move on. And then we come to this notion that science doesn't really need articles, journals, or authors. It needs stability, trustworthy collaborators, and what do you call this? A degree, of course, of exposure, so that other people can join in and improve the crystal, so to speak. So, to go to a well-known phrase, if you climb on the shoulders of giants, and most of the time they're not so giant. Most of science is not made by giants. Most of science is made by very regular people. I'm glad about that, because if it were not the case, I could not contribute. I'm not an Einstein, I'm not a Newton, I'm not even remotely close to these kinds of people. So, you know, myself and many others like me are bringing their little stone to the great edifice, but they do it because they've been able to climb on top of the edifice, and they know how to climb on top of it because they can trust the edifice. In this case, I said trust the shoulders. Newton is often given as the author of that sentence. Actually, it's not Newton who invented it. It came way farther back in the Middle Ages. And for the anecdote, this remark is actually quite nasty in the mouth of Newton, because it emerged in the midst of a priority controversy with Hooke, the other scientist of the Royal Society called Hooke. You probably know Hooke's law of elasticity, these kind of things. And at one point, Newton rather cleverly said to Hooke, "Well, I couldn't have done the work without climbing on the shoulders of of really important scientists like you know, and he called them a giant. But Hooke was a very small man, which was a very nasty way of reminding Hooke that he was not terribly physically tall, and perhaps not so tall either intellectually from the perspective of Newton, because Hooke was a rather formidable scientist in his own right. So, what does the present communication system achieve negatively? It neglects shoulders, a lot of shoulders, by virtue of the fact that so many things are simply excluded. And I'll give quickly the case of Dr. Sambhunath Dey from Calcutta. I often use that example because it's such a great example. Sambhunath Dey was in Calcutta. He had studied in England, so he has some contacts in the rich countries, and he was working on cholera. Now the problem of working on cholera is that in the North Atlantic, who cares? You know, when is the last time a Western European city had cholera? Somewhere in the 19th century, probably. You know, so it's a problem which, sure, yeah, it's interesting, but well, you know, we'll leave that to others if they have the time and the resources to do so. It doesn't concern us. Well, in Haiti, in India, in many parts of the world, cholera is still a very, very formidable enemy, and people die of cholera. So Sambhunath Dey had studied the Western theories about cholera, and had come to the conclusion that the toxins did not work the way that the Western doctrine was saying. And he began to develop a series of research and papers around that theme, which were noticed by, again, that Lederberg fellow I was mentioning earlier, who was quite impressed by those papers, and in fact tried to nominate Sambhunath Dey for a Nobel Prize in medicine. So the man was viewed by some very important scientists, including a Nobel Prize winner, as potentially a peer. He managed, this Sambhunath Dey, he managed to publish an article in Nature. Except for 15 years or so, no one reads the article. Even when you are in Nature, you're not read. If you are from Calcutta, your name is unknown, and you deal with a problem which is of no interest to not the core of science, but a certain kind of elite of science. A certain kind of elite of science. So we have to really think about, you know, what is really the core of science, if there is any, and how should it be distinguished from the elite as it is presently constituted. The present communication system neglects scientific issues. Does any one of you know when the Zika virus was discovered? In which year? 1947. 1947. Now it's coming to our shores. Oh, my God, Zika. Ebola, when was it discovered? In the 50s. We've had 2 Spaniards and 1 American who were touched by the thing and were finally saved by very good hospitals. But until then, thousands of Africans died and didn't interest anybody. How long did it take to finally get, and we're not there yet, but we're getting there now, to get a good handle on how to treat and protect people from malaria? You know, we've been doing sort of strange things about it, just enough so that people of European or North American origin can work for a while in Africa without being too subjected to the dangers of malaria. Lots of issues are simply not treated by the way we organize science because these problems are not of interest to the reigning elites of science with their journals, so-called core journals, nowadays. The present system, as I've said, overemphasizes competition. If you look at impact factors, the way they're published, you'll see that most of the time they're published with 3 decimals. Now you've done enough science to know that the number of decimals says something about the degree of precision of your measurements. I asked Garfield several years ago, many years ago, in fact, about 10 years ago, why there were 3 decimals. He responded to me by saying, well, we don't really need 3 decimals. Maybe 1 could be there, but 3 is, no, we don't need 3. He said, this is overkill, we don't need that. But he didn't explain why it was used for 3. And about 6 months or a year after I asked him the question, he gave a talk in Chicago in which he addressed that very question. And he repeated in his conference the fact that the 3 decimals were not really needed. 1 would be sufficient. But if we used only 1 decimal, we could no longer strictly rank the journals. That is, we would have journals that have an equal ranking. Oh, we don't want that. But why don't we want that? Because it exacerbates competition and it creates a better handle on the general management system of scientific research. And you find the journal editors, crowing like roosters on top of a church with the fact that they've increased their impact factor by something like that. Totally meaningless, absolutely meaningless. Yet this is the world we live in, and this is the world in which people are evaluated. The present system undervalues cooperation. There is no reward particularly for creating good teams or good cooperation. And the worst part is one that I've already discussed a little bit. Because of time, I think I'll have to stop that. It mixes scientific objectives with commercial objectives. How am I doing for time, by the way?
We still have 20 minutes.
20 minutes, but I'd like to give some questions if we can, so I'm going to move faster now. The solution, maybe we can in fact focus our discussion on that. I think we need to create new forms of scientific value. I think in particular we have to reinforce the notion of cooperation, the notion of the importance of, for example, publishing negative results, which are, when you do good work and you're testing a hypothesis and you come to, no, that's a bad hypothesis. It's useful to know that it's a bad hypothesis. Because if you're smart enough and with good enough collaborators to have created that hypothesis, there is a good chance another team will try it again. And it's a waste of resources. It's crazy. So, published negative results would be useful, particularly in clinical results, where the results are being manipulated by pharmaceutical companies who generally let go only positive results. So when you have then research done, doing an aggregate of research, clinical results to get a complete large-scale, long-time result, you have a completely biased base. Creates a crazy base for that. Why it's not discussed and disputed more? Maybe for the same reasons that it took 30 years to discover publicly that cigarettes were really dangerous. Same sort of thing, same sort of manipulation of the information again. I think we have to reform the evaluation processes. The peer review process, from my perspective, is really nothing more than giving a mode of expression, an article, a chapter in a book or a book, the right to enter the great conversation. It's a passport into scientific territory, in my mind. But the real work begins there. So what you do with this evaluation is you should really distinguish between allowing the thing to get into the conversation from seeing how people really evaluated by their usage. And if it's in open access, it can be used everywhere, not only in rich countries that have the right subscriptions to the right journals. So you have, I think there's something that makes more sense. And I think you have to also build evaluation hubs outside the rich countries. I mean, now we have an impact factor, which you may have seen on the slide that I showed you, is actually a commercial product of Thomson Reuters. You have journals in Brazil in the platform called Cielo, S-C-I-E-L-O. You can look it up in the web to see what it is. You have over 1,000 journals coming from about 16 countries in Latin America and South Africa, And many of these journals, until recently, were totally ignored by the Web of Science. Finally, with money paid to the Web of Science, they accepted to put Cielo in some sort of marginal place inside the Web of Science. You know? And that because the people of Cielo were acutely aware of the fact that if you're not at all in the Web of Science, you're invisible. You're simply invisible. As they say in Spanish, la ciencia que no se ve, no existe. I'm sure you understand that in Italian. It's an important element. So you should create evaluation hubs based on different criteria outside rich countries. Hubs that would, for example, would give some importance to the relevance of questions being raised with regard to the whole region where this problem is. For example, if you have resources, you decide in Africa to really spend it on malaria rather than spend it on some problem which is scientifically interesting and maybe even important in some circles, but which really helps you get be visible in the right journals from the right scientists in the north. What you end up doing is, one, you use rare local resources to solve other problems. Two, you're becoming visible from colleagues far in the world. And three, if you're so visible on the right problems with enough skill, you may be invited to move there. So you've been trained in your country, you've been much money, which is rare in those countries, has been spent on you, and you end up teaching in some Western university. I don't think that's a very good model for the development of the world. I simply don't think so. And the present communication system is, in my opinion, comforting this kind of situation.
Are there any questions? I actually have a question. This morning we had a talk by Professor Pivato, and she said, well, you young researchers are too weak to change the state of things. This should be on the shoulders of the older professors and policymakers, decision makers, and so on. But I think that young researchers can, there is an evaluation system that oblige the researchers to publish it in certain journals and so on. But maybe you can give us some advice to be compliant to the evaluation system, because if we want to do career in science, we have to, but still try to be more open.
This is a very important point, and thank you for bringing it up, because indeed, to the extent that I'm saying that the communication system of science is deeply flawed, and you are entering into it as young researchers, don't put your own career in jeopardy because of your understanding of how this communication system is flawed. You have to, at the beginning, unhappily, you have to play that sort of game. But that game can be played nonetheless with variations which will not endanger your career, and yet will prepare for the future. For example, maybe you find a theoretical ground which is also of great importance in our countries, but which also reaches other problems which are left, completely, which are neglected in our countries. And you can perhaps make use of that sort of information to enrich your own solution to the problem while collaborating with people from such countries. And they're showing that at some theoretical level, it's possible to build bridges without forcing people to move into your, you might say, development type research, and at the same time freeing them to work for development that is of importance. for them. I think these kinds of things can be thought about, but that requires probably, when you do your research, scientific research, it probably requires looking farther afield, deeper into forms of literature that maybe you would be looking at according to the rules that are, rules of thumb that people use to navigate the literature. It may be worthwhile to go into Seattle and see if there is not something of interest and importance for you there. Maybe some stuff in Redadic. Maybe there is stuff, in other big country national collections. China, India have their own hubs, but they are not well known and not well developed yet in some cases. China is getting there, but in fact quite there. But in the case of India, it's more problematic. But you can look farther afield. And in fact, you see, my thesis could be summarized in one short sentence. We live in a kind of globalized world, which is really centered around the rich countries, more or less North Atlantic plus Japan and China, more or less. And Japan and China have managed to move into that club, and fine. But we don't want really that kind of globalization. What we want is probably a healthy form of internationalization of science, which would allow for independent forms of questioning in various parts of the world according to the needs of the people in various parts of the world, yet coming together at some conceptual or theoretical level higher up. Science ultimately will work, of course, just as well in Africa or in Latin America. The results work everywhere. But the questions that are nourishing science don't come from everywhere. They come from only certain parts of the world, or dominated by certain parts of the world. And the result is that science, because of that, is evolving in a peculiar way. We need to redress that. And then other questions emerge and issues be developed. So in your career as young researchers, thank you very much, nothing prevents you from keeping an eye open for such opportunities and starting to establish personal bridges with colleagues in such situations where you see the notion of toxicity, for example, that some will not be developed, might well be, I'm not at all in that field of studies, but might well be a way of approaching the toxicity of a number of diseases that have not been well treated so far, precisely because that transposition has not been tried. And that's a whole area of research where what's coming from out there will nourish things here, yet would work with a common conceptual level. That's where I think you can do this work in the early stages of your career. Once you reach a certain level and you're pretty secure in that, then you can have more fun. You can really go out and do what you really feel should be done to what I would call a certain kind of scientific ethics, research ethics. It's not fair that we spend, I don't know how much money to develop something like Viagra, and meanwhile malaria is not being dealt with adequately. What the hell is going on there? Juvenile acne is regrettable, but it's not a matter of life and death. Meanwhile, people are dying of all sorts of diseases that are not being treated. And you could transpose that to many areas of knowledge. So there's an ethics, I think an ethics of orientation of research, which even young researchers can try to adhere to. It's true there will be constraints. And it's true that, especially if you're in a position where you have a 50-50 chance of making it to the next stage and getting, for example, your tenure or something like that, you're not going to take chances. And I certainly would be the last one to tell you, oh, no, don't worry about that, become a monk or whatever. No. If you want to do science, you need resources, you need labs, you need contacts, you need so on. So do get those stages behind you as quickly and as well as possible. But once you have them, allow yourself some freedom and don't be driven completely by a sort of blind competitive drive, which I think leads people into crazy stances. That would be my answer.
Thank you. Very clear and inspiring.
Thank you.
Comment if there is somebody else. I confess that I'm the label open science makes me nervous because I, as you know, I'm greatly supportive of open access to publications, and but this drive to enlarge the open access to our open science brings in my mind the risk of further controlling and further alienating scientists from their own work. In the sense that one thing is to empower them, saying if you want to share lab notes, or if you want to share preliminary data, if you want to have a blog, we fine, nothing against that. But I think there is a creeping tendency, or at least we are creating the preconditions for a shift from you could to you must. And there's going, I mean, it could be done for two different reasons. One, because somebody sees value, and so they want us to be just producers of value for somebody else. And the second, for control. How come you haven't written anything in your lab note today? And so the shift from open access to open science is not innocuous, it's not unproblematic. So I wanted to hear.
No, I quite agree. I mean, I think it takes place because of the fact that ever since something like open access began to appear, the sort of conceptual object that open access was supposed to represent and to incarnate has been, of course, the locus of a fierce battleground. And everybody, once the publishers in particular, the large publishers, became convinced that it would not go away, then the problem shifted from resisting open access period, which is what was going on from about, I would say, 2000 to maybe 2007, 8, 9 or so. When the publishers realized they couldn't let it go away, the phase, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, and finally they try to embrace you and reshape you. That's exactly what's happening now. The publishers are trying to reshape open access, and not only the publishers, the funders, the governments, and so on. Each one according to its own perspective and desires and will. Now, in the case of the publishers, the reshaping of open access has led to, first of all, the attempt to reduce all open access to the APC, so-called business model. The APC is article processing charge, so that you pay upstream once your article is accepted. You pay upstream to have the article put out in open access with a certain license. And then they even went further with the notion of hybrid journals. And this has become, you're well informed, particularly in the European Union, that there have been some really nasty battles around hybrid journals, for example, around the open air project, when the Highland project finally refused to support hybrid journals. And I can tell you just what about it. I think open science is, so there is first this attempt to reshape open access as APC, or gold open access, APC gold, rather, not gold open access, or APC gold, but they call it gold because they don't even want to hear or specify that it's APC gold. The only open access is gold, and you do gold, and you're fine. Well, this shift in vocabulary is, of course, anything but innocent, and has led to a lot of fierce reactions from a number of people, including one individual I know particularly well. He's called myself. So, well, maybe this is an illusion. Maybe I don't know myself as well as I claim, but as if. The open science thing is also something that has to be monitored very, very closely. And again, you know, the first reaction when I saw that happen from the open access movement was to try to ignore it and laugh at it. But then I decided that maybe the best attitude was to symmetrically take this thing that obviously was coming, I think, from governments in that case, and to try and recast it, rework it in a way that would be more congruent with what researchers really need, what the scientific process, what I call the grand conversation, really needs, and so on. So that's why, first of all, I like to at least contest the term open science to say libres, libres science. I think it puts people back into a familiar context, the area of software, for those who know that context. And then we can start looking at how a libre science could begin to work. For example, the issue of notebooks and data. Well, it's clear that notebooks and data don't live in the research cycle the same way than the publication. The publication you do to give to the public, that's the etymology of the term. So there's no misalignment at all between the scientific intent and the act of publishing. It's perfectly aligned. But in the case of notebooks and data, first of all, I think that a team that has done a lot of work on something that has worked very hard to finally manage to create some data that can be submitted to a good analysis, that team should have some time to do that. It seems to be clear. You don't sit and as soon as you produce data. Unless it be data coming automatically from an observation satellite or sensors in the ocean or that sort of thing. So there are kinds of data, and some kinds of data I think deserve to be treated with not a proprietary notion, but at least a kind of right of relative exclusion for a right of for those who produced it to say, yeah, I'll show it to you. No, please give me a year or two. At the same time, I do think we should put a time limit. You know, it's otherwise people just sit on things. I've seen examples of archaeologists going into some site, taking literally thousands of photographs, publishing a few articles and with a few photographs, and never showing them the rest of the photographs to anyone, and refusing to do so. Well, that makes no sense. These were photographs produced by a public money person. And once the team thinks it has exploited those photographs correctly, it seems it should be released. That doesn't prevent them from continuing to exploit them beyond what they think is a reasonable level of use, but it also allows other people to do more things with it, and it allows the conversation to take a direction. So that is important. With the question of notebooks, likewise, I mean, it could become a frightening example of terrorism on the block. You have to fill 3 pages with your notebooks. You have notebooks every day, otherwise you're not a good scientist. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense. On the other hand, once a line of research has been exhausted or exploited by the team or that, leaving the notebooks in the open allows other people to look much more closely at how the results were produced. And that's very important for reproducibility, as data is important for reproducibility. And in a world in which we are moving more and more into making models, there are a lot of things, a lot of our modes of expression nowadays are creating models. We do need access to these data in order to discuss in completely informed and open ways. So my general answer to open science there is the thing is going to be cast by a series of policies, obviously. It's very important that these policies be completely defined with full implications of well-chosen scientists. The number of Juan Carlos de Martins, in my opinion, should be more than that. The point would be that, yeah, it's we have to open up the process of science. Yes, we cannot. We agree that we cannot maintain indefinite ownership proprietary relationships and secrecy over what we've produced in science. But at the same time, there is a scientific perspective, pace of doing science that has to be maintained. And there again, if the notion of competition is, somewhat brought back to where it should belong, a bit of competition never hurt anyone, but putting everything under competition really hurts everyone. So if you get the level of competition to a lower, more serene level for specific situations in which indeed you have in the world 2, 3, 4 teams that are zeroing in on about the same solution. And is it going to be Watson and Crick's, or is it going to be Linus Pauling, to use that example? Fine, but let's not treat the whole of science as if it were constantly a Pauling versus Crick's and Watson process. So if you do that, you can really, I think, bring about a way of managing data and notebooks and other forms of process, software, and so on, in such a way that people feel comfortable, don't feel totally under total surveillance, and yet know that they can contribute in other ways to the great conversation. Sure. But it's going to be a difficult policy discussion.
I think so, yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yeah. I would like to share with you a brief reflections on new forms of scientific value and reform evaluation processes in software engineering field, because many times I've read the papers that describe algorithms and approaches of implemented software, but many times I didn't find a public repository in which this code should be published. And sometimes the quality of this code is really bad, so it's not really usable. And in the examples that you have mentioned in the first part of your presentation, like Mozilla, Linux, they had an extraordinary success because, okay, they are used the first time, but they also are collaborative projects. So in my experience, there are many platforms like GitHub, Bitbucket, in which you can share code at the beginning, but this code can be starred, you can follow the evolution of this code, and you can also fork this code, and you can create your own version of the code and try to improve it. Right. I think that evaluating this data on a platform like GitHub could be, in my opinion, in the software engineering field, a good point in order to evaluate the quality of your research work. That's a suggestion or a comment on this.
Say that again? How would you do that?
For example, if I count the star on your repository, if I count how many your repository is forked, can be a metric for measure the quality of your work.
That's exactly a particular example of a way to revise and reform evaluation. If you use my metaphor of the peer review process ante as simply a situation where you give the passport to enter the scientific territory, which is roughly, by the way, is what +1 is doing. +1, for example, says, well, when you look at the quality of the work, they've been criticized at times for not doing that sufficiently and so on. It may be true, but what's important is that they've said we completely forget about editorial orientation. We are not going to do a refusal of article because it doesn't fit with our journal. In a mega journal, it makes sense, of course. And we're just going to check the basic stuff there. That's then we see how usage is going to be and what people comment on the paper and how it's being cited in other papers. So that's exactly one form thing. The paper is allowed to enter the fray, so to speak, of scientific rough and tumble, and then you see how the rough and tumble is taking place inside science. Now, I think that's a very good way of doing it. Another way of doing it is that you probably are familiar with that, the so-called Faculty of 1000. Do you know about that?
No.
It emerged around Biomed Central way back. Biomed Central invented both the APC business model and this faculty 1000. The idea was to say, you know, articles in the world are quite often neglected or forgotten, you know, that for a wide variety of reasons. We're going to put together a group of people, around 1,000 of them, who are legitimately recognized as competent, good scientists. And we're going to let them, and across what they read and search in their own work, identify the articles which they can identify as articles that have been undervalued, and then bring them up to light. Okay? And through this mechanism, that's another way of creating value differently. And all, I mean, you can invent a number of these. There have been many suggestions already. I didn't have time today to give you a sort of table or landscape of that, but there is a whole series of possibilities in this regard. And that's what I'm calling for, is including the possibility of these kinds of evaluations being done also from centers that are not in the North Atlantic. The people in Africa, people in Asia, Latin America, can look at papers and look at journals differently and start working with that. And ultimately, as I've said, I think we should really think about moving out of journals, moving out of papers, and moving out of authors. There will be individuals always, of course, but not behaving like authors, behaving as people who are sort of contributing to something as a developer is contributing code to a general project, which is a big, could be a big part of science. It's this sort of reform which I think will ultimately happen because of digitization. There is no reason to keep the journal and article constraints that print brought about.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you not. Thank you again. Ok, qualche minuto di pausa prima di